General operations management refers to the day-to-day operational tasks that we have to keep our infrastructure working as designed and to ensure that we're meeting the needs of our organization. And certainly in the cloud, we have the same operations management concerns that we would have in our own environment, although there are a few distinctions. So these are the basic operations management guidelines. These are actually taken from the SANS standard, or the framework from SANS. But you can apply each one of these to the cloud. I should probably mention that when it comes to cloud operations management, probably one of the things that makes operations management much easier is that scalable nature of the cloud, where we can increase our resources on the fly. And of course, that's great that we could do that, but we do always have to be cognizant of the cost to do so. So it is always possible to increase your resource utilization, but sometimes we want to make sure that we're not designing our infrastructure in such a way that we need that sort of bottomless pit of resources. But in any event, it does make it a little bit easier for us for operations management. But certainly some things get a little bit more abstract when we go to the cloud as well, which is certainly something to think about. So all of these continue to apply in the cloud environment. So we have information security management, which we've discussed before, configuration management, in other words, having a way to standardize your configurations and ensure that they're documented, having a change management procedure in place to make sure that you are documenting changes, that changes aren't made before they're approved. It's kind of dangerous in larger organizations. You know, if you're in a small IT shop, change management can kind of be more on the fly when there's just a few people. But when you have large teams and things like that, and when changes could have a drastic impact on the organization, it's important to have a very formal change management process. Incident management, which I'm going to talk about here in a few minutes. Problem management, in other words, being able to handle problems as they occur day to day. So that's an operational problem. Probably a great example of problem management is something like a help desk staff. So you have a staff that's prepared for and trained to deal with day-to-day issues with users and things like that. Just all the things that come up day to day, with respect to operations. And then business continuity management to make sure that in the event of downtime, we have operations that can ensure that we have a continuity of operations. And continual service improvement management. In other words, making sure that we have some process and procedures in place that allow us to periodically review our processes and our infrastructure to make sure that we have what we need and that we're providing the necessary services to the organization. Now, information security management involves all of these items. So security management, security policy, information security organization, asset management, HR security, physical, environmental, communications, operations, access control, so forth and so on. So each of these, of course, is still important in the cloud, but again, from an operations perspective, these things don't change a lot other than the topics that we've covered already in this course. So we've already talked about, for example, we've talked about security policy. I talked a little bit about how that works and how that might have to change a little bit when we're moving to the cloud. Asset management becomes obviously a bit different because our assets are now virtual. They're now sitting in the cloud if we're a cloud-based infrastructure, if we're utilizing some aspects of the cloud. And likewise, asset management can also become a little bit more abstract in our own virtualized environments as well. So physical and environmental security changes quite a bit if you were in the cloud because now we don't have our own physical plant. Instead, we're just making sure that our cloud service provider has adequate measures to protect their physical plant, which with most of the large providers kind of goes without saying, but certainly something that we should be diligent with and understand. Communications and operations management is still important, and more so even in the cloud, the communications piece in telecom, because if we lose our access to the cloud, then we lose our ability to conduct business. Whereas before we're in the cloud, when everything's in our own infrastructure, as long as our own infrastructure is adequate, then we can still have operations even if we don't have internet access, for example. But that can slightly change in that type of environment. Access control, of course, becomes more important because everything's public in the cloud when we're in the cloud. So that becomes a more acute concern for us to make sure that we have adequate controls for access to those systems, whether it's the management plane or the systems themselves or any of the other offerings that we discussed in this class. But for sure, there's a new a new avenue of attack. There's a new attack surface area in the cloud that we have to be aware of. Acquisition, deployment, and maintenance changes considerably in the cloud as well, because now we can acquire and deploy systems much more quickly than we could in our own infrastructure, unless of course we have a virtualized infrastructure. But even still, you have a kind of a finite amount of resources in your own infrastructure. But if you recall, in the cloud, we can burst to just about anything as long as we have the budget to do so. But we don't have to install hardware or anything like that to utilize those resources. So configuration management is the development and implementation of new configurations that apply to the hardware and software configurations of the cloud environment. So your book talks about some concerns with configuration management in the cloud and what might be unique to the cloud. So I encourage you certainly to read those sections in your book. But they do talk a little bit about these configuration management issues and some of the tools that might be available to us for configuration management in the cloud that maybe we don't have available to ourselves in our own environments. But you can certainly take a look at those. As far as change management goes, so change management, as I said before, is pretty important. But basically what we're doing with change management is people are identifying things that need to change. They could be operational things that need to change. They could be additional software. It could be enhancements to our workflows and to our software, and things of that nature. So those requests come in, and we have to handle those requests. And as in an immature IT department, you might just start applying those changes as they come up and just trying to meet your users' requests and their needs because you see yourselves as a service department, which is okay, but we have no record of those changes. So if anything breaks, the problem with these large organizations is sometimes a change that you make in one system has unintended consequences in other areas that you didn't think of. And that's what a change control board is all about. So in a change control board, all of these changes go to a body that evaluates that change, and that body has representation from all of the functional areas of the organization. So for example, I work in healthcare, and our change control boards in most healthcare organizations contain representatives from all of the various departments within a hospital. So if I go to a change control board, there'll be somebody from all of the ologies, radiology and emergency medicine and podiatry and cardiology and all of the different departments, the pharmacy, the labs, even dietary, the people that cook the food have somebody that represents their department, and all the changes are brought up, and everyone has to think about how this might affect their division or their department or the software that they're using in their division or their department. And even little things like downtime. Somebody might say, okay, we're gonna have our system down for from 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. to make this change. And then somebody in dietary says, wait a minute, if you bring that system down, we won't be able to access it to see the dietary restrictions of patients on that floor, because that's when we start making breakfast, right? Because hospitals are big and sometimes they have to start cooking early. So little issues like that maybe we wouldn't think of operating in our silo, they come to the surface when you're in a change control board meeting, and then everyone can agree on what the best practice is going to be or the best way to move forward. And again, to minimize any impact on the organization. So that's a little bit of how change management is handled in most organizations. And as far as the cloud goes, change management really doesn't change that much. It's the same process. Obviously, changes are a little bit different in the cloud, because we have this management plane that we use to make certain changes. Some changes are beyond our control. I recently had that experience where a cloud service provider was making a large change, and they didn't really give us a voice in that change. It was simply on Thursday, August 3rd, this is going to happen, whether you like it or not. And we just had to prepare for it and work with it with our customers that were using that environment. So those types of changes in the cloud, and we've talked about that, how there's you lose a little bit of control when you're in the cloud. You're sort of at their mercy. But hopefully your SLAs codify some of the effects of those changes, and you have a way to handle those. We've talked about incident management before. Basically, incident management, the primary purpose of incident management is to make sure that number one, the most important thing is when there is an incident, we want to make sure that we're able to recover to previous operations as quickly as possible with the least amount of impact to our users and to our organization. And the second thing is to learn from that incident. That's the second purpose, to make sure that we can learn from the incident, to make sure that if it happens again, or is there a way to, can we, what can we learn to more quickly recover and to be prepared for it? And the other purpose, of course, with is to minimize the impact if it happens again by maybe trying to find ways to mitigate the possibility of that incident after we learn about it. So really, it's all about learning about what happened, what can we do better next time, and what can we do to help prevent this. And the other facet is to make sure that we have a framework in place to handle incidents the most effective way possible to minimize downtime. So to that end, the incident management plan, one of the most important things you're going to have in incident management plans is going to be the sort of process and the procedure if there is an incident that tells everyone exactly what needs to be done. And we've talked about that before in this course. Now with the cloud, incident management does change a little bit in the sense that, just as I've been saying with other aspects in IT security, we do lose a bit of control. So incidents can happen in the cloud service provider that we either don't even know about or that we don't have the ability to investigate for whatever reason. All we can do is rely on the cloud service provider to send us an email saying, "Here's what happened on October 4th," and this is what we're going to do to prevent that in the future. So to some extent, a lot of incident management does get sort of outsourced to the cloud service provider for certain aspects. But our own incidents, of course, we do still have to handle. So these might be data breaches within our own cloud infrastructure, cloud outages that are caused by us through some telecommunications or bad configurations and things of that nature. So incident management does still play a key role even when we're in a cloud-based infrastructure. And finally, for operations, we have a release and second to last thing. We still have one more section here, but release and deployment management. In other words, how do we release new products? How do we release new workflows and new services within our infrastructure? Now, with the cloud, of course, this does this is probably in some respects easier and in some respects harder. And you can certainly that'd be a really good discussion topic, is to talk about as far as deployment, what changes in deployment in the cloud. And also, it's really important with the cloud, and this is as far as cloud security, service level management becomes really important. So SLAs are basically an understanding between the two parties as to what is expected from a service. So in other words, how much uptime can I expect? What kind of speeds can I expect? So for example, most of you probably have internet at home, and you probably have some expectation of how well that internet's going to work and whether or not you can stream movies and things like that. And I'm sure there are times that you try to use that internet and it doesn't work right. And unfortunately, there's not much we can do about that except take our business elsewhere, because we don't have a formal SLA usually with our with those providers. Although I guess to some extent we do, because they codify into their agreements that that these things can happen, that there is no guarantee to the bandwidth. They might tell us that we're going to get 50 megabits per second, but in the fine print they tell us that that's not the reality, that that's not always going to happen, and that they're not liable if it doesn't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in a corporate or in an enterprise or an organization, we do have not only the ability, but probably a responsibility to make sure that we negotiate SLAs that are going to meet our needs. Now, that may mean that we're going to pay more for those services, but that's the cost of doing business, right? If we need to, if we're relying heavily on on certain aspects of services being available, like the cloud, then we have to be willing to pay for that as well. But not only are we willing to pay for that, but we also have to be able to hold that service provider responsible for providing what they're contracted for, and have remedies available to us when that's not provided. So for example, if I have a data center and they tell me that they're going to have electricity and heating and cooling and all that, and to a certain extent, and they don't provide that, I should be able to go back and get some, not only get money back, but get damages in the event of an adverse something adverse happens to my infrastructure because of their failure, because of my expectation, right? I had an expectation they were providing a service. And our cloud service providers can do the same thing. So we can codify into those SLAs exactly what our expectations are for uptime, for the performance on the systems that we allocate, and so forth. Now, it's difficult to do a service level agreement with the big providers like Google and so forth and Amazon, unless you're a large organization, which is possible. I mean, there are ways, of course, to negotiate with them and to an SLA that meets your needs. But in most cases, your SLA is sort of laid out when you create the service and choose how you're going to use their service. So, for example, in our lab with Azure, I had you guys in my instructions, I tell you to use the A0 basic. And if you read the fine print on the A0 basic VM, they tell you that you really don't get much of an expectation with an A0 basic. I think the SLA on that is 99% uptime, which is really not that good. I think it's 99.95 actually, which sounds like it's pretty good, but that's not great. 99.999 would be industry standard. But because we pay so little for that A0, we don't have an expectation of that high availability. And likewise, your data storage was with that A0 was only on one location rather than three replicants. So, you lose a little bit there as well. But again, we're not willing to pay the money for that high availability. But that's certainly something that we need to make sure we're aware of. So we don't want to just pick the least expensive item, because it barely meets our needs. We want to make sure that we look at the other aspects as well. So an OLA, or an organizational level agreement, is like an SLA, but it's negotiated between internal business units. So if you're working in an IT organization and you have, and basically you view your departments within that organization and divisions within that organization as customers, you might have an OLA within your organization. So you make a commitment to your customers within the organization on the on what they can expect from your services, from your IT services. And then finally, there's underpinning contracts. So an underpinning contract is between the organization and vendors or suppliers to make sure they can meet an SLA. So for example, if I was running a large data center and I had my own cloud service that I was offering, I might have an SLA with my customers, but then I have underpinning contracts with the vendors within my data center to ensure that I can meet those SLAs. So, and that's where things like power and cooling and all of the infrastructure type things that we've discussed, I have to bring into play. To make sure that those underpinning contracts will allow me to meet the SLA. So in other words, if my underpinning contract with the HVAC provider is that if there's an outage in the HVAC in one of my units, that their turnaround time is 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, within 24 hours, right? That's not very good, right? And that's probably going to impact my ability to provide services to the customers with which I have an SLA. So I want to make sure that I have a contract with those vendors that gives me the turnaround time that I need, maybe 24-hour turnaround time within, not within 24 hours, but anytime, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with 1 hour callback or 1 hour on site or something like that to make sure that I don't suffer that uptime. And then we have continuity management, which is the ability to make sure that we have business continuity, that our systems are always operational when they need to be, and that we minimize downtime. And this is one of those things that the cloud does make a lot easier for us from a technical perspective. In our own environment, if we're building our own virtual machines, our own virtual infrastructure, we have to plan and design and architect that high availability. Whereas in the cloud, it's almost done for us. And it's funny, I had this conversation not long ago with somebody in my office that we're so used to having to design these high availability architectures. I was working with a customer who was going to move their database into Azure, and in their own environment, they have four Microsoft SQL servers that are enterprise wide, that have replication and the always on functionality, and they're clustered and the whole 9 yards. And they wanted to move some of those databases into Azure because they don't want to maintain their own infrastructure anymore, which is great. But they were telling me how they were going to spin up 4 Azure instances for their replication and all that stuff. And they were like, well, we're not sure how to set up always on with that and how that works. And I thought, well, this is silly because Azure in their SLA already tells us that they have like 5 locations for Azure when you spin up an instance. So they're already doing all that on the back end. So there's really no need for us to do that on the front end. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have disaster recovery, right? We should still have some disaster recovery. If you recall, they're very different. Disaster recovery and business continuity are different things. Business continuity is all about making sure we have 100% uptime or trying to get as close to that as possible, where disaster recovery is when we do have that major disaster that causes an outage that we couldn't foresee, that we have a way to recover from that. And that would be data backups that are offline and so forth. So I would still back up that data, but going to the cloud means that sometimes I don't have to be as concerned. We have to get outside that box of thinking about it as physical infrastructure, because it's, again, it's a utility. They're handling all that stuff for us. We're paying for that. That's part of why we're paying the cloud service provider. So that's where continuity management might change quite a bit when you're moving to the cloud, in the sense that we have to understand whether or not it's offered, and then whether or not we even need to do that. So that's one of the first things, is we have to wrap our heads around how they're doing that business continuity on their side, and then try to evaluate whether or not that business continuity has to happen on our side.